Hello everybody, my name is Shizue, and last night, my buddy SFP managed to get his hands on the Ultimate Guide 2.0, and because of it, we were able to actually come together in a giant VC of FNAF YouTubers and solve Midnight Motorist. And in fact, the way we did it is even more bizarre than the fact that we did it. So that's the point of this video, to explain what just happened within the last 24 hours. To give you guys a little bit more context, as you all know, for a long time, Scott Cawthon has been releasing guidebooks that are intended to contain information and theories in order to catch people up with what's being talked about in the Five Nights at Freddy's space, so that way they don't have to play catch-up and can just read these books, understand what's going on inside of the community today. Of course, these books tend to occasionally have issues inside of them, which is why I and many other theorists don't tend to use them as any sort of confirming bias of saying, oh, this information must be confirmed because it's inside of these books, because they usually do contain errors, and there's no way to actually determine whether or not the information that you're receiving here is an error or not. And we usually get new versions of these guidebooks that are intended to fix the issues that had come previously and introduce more information from the newer games or new book series and things like that that are important for understanding the community of Five Nights at Freddy's at the time. With this being said, a lot of people were excited when they found out that the Ultimate Guide was getting a revamp with the Ultimate Guide 2.0. This was intended to contain information all the way up to Secret of the Mimic, as well as being looked over by a very professional Five Nights at Freddy's fan, DJ Sturf, who had 224 pages worth of edits that were intended to fix the issues inside of this book. And I'm sorry to disappoint everyone that thought this was actually going to happen, but it ended up not happening. Just a few weeks ago, we actually got leaks of the book, and inside of this leak, we ended up seeing the table of contents. Listing throughout all of the table of contents, the games were pretty accurate to what was going on. However, before Secret of the Mimic and after Help Wanted, there was a game that nobody actually knew. Most people thought it was actually the result of an error, in that it was just a misprint. It wasn't actually meant to be there, because the only game that came out during that time was Into the Pit game, and so we just kind of concluded that, well, it sure does suck that Into the Pit game is just getting 4 pages inside of this guidebook, but clearly that must be what's happening. I mean, we already know Sturf went in and gave them a bunch of information. So imagine everyone's surprise when last night a lot of these books were actually found physical edition in many different places, and my friend SFP managed to get his hands on one. Of course, his first inclination was to actually look into this whole Chica's secret party that was mentioned in the original screenshot, because clearly that had to be bullshit and had to have been fixed. And it turns out it wasn't, and when he turned to the page, he discovered it was not a misprint. It wasn't even Into the Pit game. No, this was 4 dedicated pages to a game that physically does not exist. This was incredible. He raced home in order to specifically look at this book within full detail in a full group chat of a bunch of FNAF theorists in order to understand what was going on inside of this book. And let me tell you, it is incredible the amount of information that's stated here, despite being a game that just doesn't exist. And so I will end up telling you everything that was recorded inside of the Chica's secret party pages. Chica's throwing a party. At this party, there are plenty of guests to feed, sweet cupcakes, and some very unwanted guests that crash the party. Chica's secret party was nearly a secret game, as it was only available online for a short time, 3 days to be precise, on scottgames.com, back in 2016. Information and tips can still be found on fan wiki websites about the elusive secret party, so check them out if you want to know more. Chica moves through her secret party, hopping and jumping through levels, collecting all the pink cupcakes she can scoop up. Throughout the levels, there are babies demanding yummy cupcakes. Chica brings the babies the cupcakes she collected, turning the crying babies into happy babies. The more babies she appeases powers up her life force, allowing her to speed up when needed for special levels. The question is, can Chica accomplish all of the levels without being caught by the mysterious shadow figures? The secret party levels are filled with upset babies, whom Chica must feed cupcakes to in order to accomplish her tasks. In most of the levels, the babies are happy with just one cupcake. Chica discovers that occasionally the babies need more than one cupcake to stop their tantrums, and sometimes she needs to be super fast to accomplish her tasks. In a stealth game twist, there are two shadow figures sneaking through the party as well. Chica needs to follow one of the shadow figures to discover who the person behind the shadow is. When she finds herself toe-to-toe with a shadow figure, her best bet is to run in the opposite direction and hide. Beware, it's very important to not follow the wrong shadow figure, or else. The secret party takes place in a house that is a maze of adventurous goals with 10 crafty levels to complete in order to win the game. There are 2 bedrooms and a secret room, a bathroom, a kitchen and dining area, a living room, and a office, garage, basement, and attic. All with a unique undertaking that Chica must tackle in order to beat the levels, and ultimately say goodnight to her guests. The room levels are sporadically laid out throughout a 3-story house. Interestingly, Fredbear appears walking through the hallways. Chica may find it useful to see what he has to say, however, when he decides to talk to her is somewhat of a mystery. Chica may discover interesting secret tips and tools throughout the party to help her fulfill her goals. Not only is the basement dark and creepy, but also a pipe is broken and the basement is filling up with water. There are 3 crying babies that need to be fed cupcakes and saved, each one strategically hidden within the dark basement. Once you feed a baby, the little one stops crying and floats happily onto the rising water and safely out of the basement window. However, Chica must save the babies within a 3-minute time limit. Once Chica completes this level, the doorbell in the front door rings. When Chica opens the door, a package is left on the doorstep. Inside, the package is a secret tool, a block of cheese. Most interestingly is that once Chica completes a level, Fredbear is ready to talk. He shares just how much dogs love pizza. 3 babies are crying and sprawled across the kitchen and dining area. There are cupcakes hidden within the kitchen cupboards. The challenge is a very sneaky dog, wanting to jump and gobble up the cupcakes once Chica opens a cupboard. In order to distract the sneaky dog, Chica must grab a pizza cooking in the oven to entice the hungry hound away from the cupcakes, giving Chica enough time to feed the needy babies. The sneaky mutt eats quickly, and Chica can only grab another pizza after 30 seconds. Chica may or may not need a power-up in order to feed these babies. The impatient babies were more than a little distraught and knocked over things in the living room. A circuit has blown and the lamps are flashing off and on. Each time the lights flash back on, the babies have moved into a different spot, leaving Chica confused. Once you step into the living room, the timer flashes to 1:30 and begins a countdown, and yikes, one of the shadow figures just might catch Chica when she's not looking. Chica must find the hidden cupcakes and catch the babies in the right place when the light flashes on in the order to feed them before the timer runs out, or before she's caught off guard. When Chica looks out the master bedroom window, she mysteriously sees Bonnie walking back and forth in the backyard. In the bedroom, there are 2 crying babies. One is on the top of the bed, and another is in the closet, with cupcakes nowhere to be seen. As Chica approaches the bed, she notices some pink frosting on the floor. Moving closer to inspect, a golden fuzzy hand snaps out, nearly catching Chica by the leg. Chica hops out of the way just in time. Chica needs to figure out how to get the guarded cupcakes from under the bed without getting snatched up. Chica later returns with a tiny black hat. Once the hand reaches out, Chica offers the black hat, and in return, she is given a plate of 2 pink cupcakes. Chica moves into a kid's room filled with scattered toys and wall posters of Freddy Fazbear. There's one crying baby in the middle of the bedroom, but once again, the elusive cupcakes are missing. Chica decides to pick up the toys and move them into the toy box. Her cleanliness pays off. Once all the toys have been picked up, a drawer opens with a cupcake inside for the hungry baby. Unbeknownst to Chica, the secret room can only be unlocked after you have cleared the 2 bedroom levels. The secret room has an interesting and useful secret tool, one that can help her finish the game, an essential golden key. It's here that you'll also catch a glimpse of a box that longtime fans will be familiar with, as well as a peek inside, which won't be spoiled here, to those creative enough to find their way to it. The home office is quite small with only 2 crying babies, and a strange gray man sitting at the desk. The obstacle is finding the undisclosed cupcakes. Chica looks around but doesn't see them. Aha! That is until she discovers a locked mini safe. Chica must discover the 4-digit code in order to get the cupcakes. The gray man doesn't seem to want to chat, so Chica leaves to find the 4-digit code. Later on, Chica retrieves a 4-digit code and opens the safe, quickly feeding the babies. Finally, the gray man decides to speak, giving a hint about something scary under the bed. In the bathroom, Chica is tasked with capturing a floating cupcake in the bathtub to appease the wailing baby sitting on the floor. Chica must take out the floating duck toys in order to drain the water from the tub, so she can grab the cupcake and feed the impatient baby. surprise, there is something else that is very significant at the bottom of the tub. The dreary garage is filled with boxes, old bikes, rusty tools, and a broken down car. There are 4 crying babies and cupcakes waiting for Chica. However, there's a problem. Scurrying rats are trying to steal the cupcakes. Chica needs the secret tool of the cheese in order to distract the scurrying rats from stealing the cupcakes. With the rats distracted by the cheese, Chica can accomplish the task of collecting the cupcakes and feeding the bellowing babies. After the babies are appeased, an old static radio flickers on and starts repeating a series of numbers. Chica needs to remember these numbers for something important. Chica realizes she needs a golden key in order to enter the final level. The attic is the grand finale, with 10 hidden hungry babies and 20 cupcakes in a mass of storage boxes and old trunks. 1 cupcake is not enough for each baby, and the additional challenge is that the boxes and trunks will move and shift like a moving maze. Chica has a difficult time finding out where she's been or where she is going, all the while trying to beat a 3-minute clock. Watch out for those shadow figures, they pop up at the most unfortunate of times. Hopefully, Chica saved a power-up or 2 for this level in order to finish under 3 minutes. Cha-cha-cha, Chica wins the game by feeding all the babies with sweet cupcakes. Her secret party is over, and she's pacified all her guests and managed to elude the shadow figures, who have thankfully vanished as stealthily as they appeared. Suddenly, music blasts through the house and confetti showers around her. All her uninvited guests, Fredbear, Greyman, Bonnie, and Golden Freddy, move through the halls dancing. Chica decides to join the dance train throughout the house. After all, the party doesn't have to end. Now, after looking through all of these interpretations, it came and gave us a few good conclusions off rip. This house is clearly the same exact house that was present inside of Midnight Motorist. We can see that with the screenshot that's present inside of the book. And if this is the case, and we're distinctly told that someone was walking around in the backyard, something that we saw in Midnight Motorist, it should suggest that whoever the footprints belong to in Midnight Motorist is the same exact person who was walking around in the backyard, which is just described as Bonnie. Which version of Bonnie, we have no clue. However, the fact that it was Bonnie at all kind of raises some flags, because inside of this minigame we also saw that kid's bedroom, and inside of that bedroom we had the one crying child. The implication there seems to be that the crying child is the runaway inside of Midnight Motorist, the one who will be sorry when he gets back. With confirmation of the crying child being the one who's run away, then that kind of makes Spring Bonnie no longer on the table, as if there was a Spring Bonnie, it likely isn't William Afton, as William Afton wouldn't be going outside to lure his own son out of his house. The easier interpretation here is that whether it be Spring Bonnie, Shadow Bonnie, or just Bonnie in general, all 3 of these interpretations suggest that the missing children's incident has already occurred in the timeline, as there should be no other way for all 3 of these characters to be present outside of the crying child's room. And if this is the case, then this kind of throws the entire theorizing space on its head, because for a long time it has been the common consensus that the missing children's incident takes place in 1985. This was the result of it both being told us inside of the novels, as well as being doubled down on inside of the Fazbear Frights novellas, in which it stated that the missing children's incident was in 1985, something that the Into the Pit game and Return to the Pit would end up echoing. If this is the case and the missing children's incident is in 1983, this creates a very interesting rendition of the timeline where the missing children died before the crying child. And if we're going to take it a step farther, the fact that this is Midnight Motorist, later that night, that would also suggest that Charlie and the missing children both died prior to the crying child being bitten in 1983, confirming the death year of every single child victim so far. Now, this idea isn't new by any means. This idea has also been suggested by my buddy Freddn, by my friends over at Do a Process Theory. Hell, even MadPad at one point believed MCI83. However, I feel like the person who really took the victory with inside of this situation was kind of John Fuhnaff, as if this is taking place during 1983 and is showing the missing children's incidents, then his rendition of Midnight Motorist is the most likely interpretation for what's going on here. That the mound that we saw inside of Midnight Motorist was intended to actually be Susie's dog from Fruity Maze, as the only other place where we see a pile of dirt inside of the game is specifically a sprite in Fruity Maze, a sprite that's directly connected to Spring Bonnie, and a box where a dog's body was inside of. The easy interpretation there is that the mound is actually intended to be Susie's dog. This is something that John kind of went against because he believed that the MCI at the time took place in 1985. However, if the MCI takes place in 1983, this works as the perfect glue to put together all of the minigames present in FFPS. It was a way of showing that all of them take place connected to each other, that the missing children's incident was the first event in the timeline, leading to Charlie's death, explaining the creation of the security puppet, as well as the missing posters that we see outside of the security puppet minigame, and then later that night showing that Midnight Motorist was actually about the crying child following Bonnie, and that the mound was just Susie's dog. That's the direct connection, showing that all of them were directly connected. And then obviously leading into Five Nights at Freddy's 4, where the crying child would end up being bit, saying that our main 6 victims, the ones who have been on these gravestones and have been with us since Happiest Day, they all die in 1983. And like that, we have a pretty good, evident interpretation of Midnight Motorist. There are other details established inside of this game that seems to give us a little bit more clues about what's going on here. I've previously suggested that the shadow animatronics were a singular character created from William Afton's wickedness. However, this game seems to suggest differently, stating that there are actually 2 different shadow characters, one that is intentionally trying to help the player, whereas one is trying to hurt the player. This has been kind of a concept that's been thrown around, specifically with the information established in Five Nights at Freddy's 6, suggesting that Shadow Freddy was actually trying to lure the children back to that place into the safe room because it was trying to help Afton in some way as a trick that Afton was putting on all of the kids, whereas the Shadow Bonnie has been put in several situations which seems to suggest that he's actually trying to help the children, albeit inside of the Five Nights at Freddy's 3 minigames, or the ability of give gifts inside of FNAF World, and lastly his appearance inside of FNAF AR. The last mystery this game seems to solve is explicitly what the contents of the FNAF 4 box is. However, the book goes out of its way to claim that we're not allowed to know what was inside of the box. So theoretically, if we ever got to play this game, we would be able to know what was inside of the box. And with that being said, I feel like we should transition into another topic. Did this game ever exist? I mean, we don't have physical proof of it ever existing, but did it ever exist? Well, firstly, my buddies already went through and looked at the Wayback Machine. There is no recordable evidence of a game like this ever existing back in 2016, let alone the fact that 2016 was the release year of Sister Location, which contained specifically things like source code information and everything else. Chances are, if there was something going on back then, it would have been instantly found by the theorists that were incredibly try-hard back then and were trying to find every little detail. There's no world where they didn't check every little nook and cranny just because it's not recorded on the Wayback Machine. It is possible, however, that this minigame did exist privately as just a concept or as a game in Scott Cawthon's library that he just chose to never end up releasing. And the only good evidence that I could see of this actually being the case is explicitly the security logbook. Inside of the security logbook for a very long time, there's been one thing that has been overlooked and has been ultimately just kind of ignored and put to the side for years, and that was explicitly the very end of the book. There is a picture that has no correlation whatsoever to the contents of whatever the hell is happening during the logbook time period, which is a Chica variant that seems to be destroyed but has the Endo O2 inside of her. A lot of people quickly interpreted this to actually be what appears to be a scrap Chica intended for FNAF 6. However, we didn't really get much more information about that, and more people kind of considered that this was just an abandoned concept by Scott that he just chose to never go that direction of. Mind you, the logbook was released with information pertaining all the way up to Sister Location, and nothing there that explicitly states that the book was written during FNAF 6. So it's completely possible that Scott Cawthon did come up with this minigame back in 2016, and that this logbook Chica was actually intended to be connected to this minigame. If this were to be the case, it would explain kind of what was going on inside of FNAF 6 itself, as FNAF 6 originally opened up as a minigame section that was then cut off with us seeing Scrap Elizabeth inside of the game. There is a world world where this theoretically could have been replaced in the opening of FNAF 6 was instead this Chica's new party game, with Scrap Chica being the character that we see in the very beginning. However, due to the lore kind of not working within the favor of having a Scrap Chica exist at the time, this then is why Scott would end up abandoning that idea as well as this minigame altogether. However, regardless of whether or not this minigame actually existed back in 2016, I don't think that it's a mistake that it ended up showing up inside of this guidebook. It's not a mistake that it was conveniently placed in between Help Wanted and Secret of the Mimic, two incredibly modern games that came out within the most recent years. If this was truly intended to be a recordable of something that had occurred all the way back in 2016, one would think that it would have been either placed before or after Sister Location, yet it was placed as a modern game, which is rather weird. And going through the actual language of the way that this is worded of a secret project that very few people got to see because it was only available for 3 days on the Scott Games website, and if you want more information, you have to go look at fan wikis, despite the fact that this is a guidebook intended to help people in the FNAF community understand what's going on inside of those games. It doesn't line up. The logic just isn't there. It doesn't make sense for this to be referring to a game that actually released back in 2016. Rather, everything here seems to be suggesting that this is some sort of ARG or teaser for something that's going to come up very soon. And I believe that's the case. I think that this secret Chica's party is actually intended to either be a teaser for the Secret of the Mimic DLC, or is going to be an actual mini-game we can play in the Secret of the Mimic DLC. Why I specifically choose those events is because of the contents that are actually happening in the minigame, particularly pertaining to the contents of the FNAF 4 box, in Midnight Motorist, in The Crying Child, and everything else involving that era of the games. Mind you, a lot of people, including myself, believe that the Secret of the Mimic DLC is going to be centered around the Fall Fest of 1983, because although it has been mentioned multiple times, we haven't actually been told what happened there. We're just kind of given little glimpses of potential information of something that could have happened during Fall Fest of 1983, but nothing actually says what happened during that incident, and it feels like we've been building up to the Fall Fest of 1983. For a long time, we were told by Steel Wool that they've been wanting to make a Fredbear's game, and that feels like the perfect opportunity for them to do so. And if we're specifically having a game that's set around the time period of FNAF 4, giving us a Midnight Motorist story that actually tells us what the contents of the FNAF 4 box is, kind of feels in style for the series. It would be possible for a minigame to, or albeit a external game that was released as a teaser for the Secret of the Mimic DLC, to exist and it still make incredible sense for what's about to happen next. I think that this is just too weird of a situation to be written off as just some silly joke or a mistake on the part of Scholastic. Everything here feels specific, like it was intended to be setting something up, and I think that's exactly what Scott Cawthon is attempting to do. And I would also like to say that it wouldn't be too surprising if when we actually get to open up that box, the inside may or may not be a golden Freddy mask. But that's just a theory, and I will see you all again soon. Mata ne!